What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets daytime television's most outspoken liberal voice? You're about to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history, where Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor finally cracks under relentless provocation, leading to a dramatic exit that left the entire studio in stunned silence. This is the story of how a routine promotional interview turned into a verbal battlefield that nobody saw coming. But before we dive into this incredible showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about celebrities walking out of interviews. The morning started like any other at the View's Manhattan studio. Clint Eastwood had agreed to appear on the show to promote his latest directorial effort, a character study about aging and redemption in small-town America. At 94, the legendary filmmaker and actor remained as sharp and commanding as ever, his weathered face carrying the weight of decades in Hollywood. The show's producers had assured his team it would be a straightforward interview focusing on his career and new project. As the cameras rolled for the live broadcast, Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with her characteristic warm introduction. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a true Hollywood legend with us today. Please welcome the one and only Clint Eastwood." The audience erupted in applause as Eastwood walked onto the set, his posture still commanding despite his age. He settled into the guest chair with the quiet confidence that had defined his screen presence for over 6 decades. "Clint, thank you so much for being here," Whoopi continued, her tone respectful and professional. "Your new film has been getting incredible reviews. Tell us about what drew you to this particular story." Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly tone that had captivated audiences since the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s. "Well, Whoopi, it's a story about second chances, about people finding meaning in the later chapters of their lives. I've always been drawn to characters who face their demons and come out stronger on the other side." Sarah Haynes, sitting to Whoopi's right, jumped in with enthusiasm. "The themes in your films have always resonated with audiences across generations. What do you hope people take away from this one?" "I hope they understand that it's never too late to make things right," Eastwood replied, his eyes moving across the panel. "Whether you're 20 or 90, you can still choose to be better than you were yesterday." Sunny Hostin nodded approvingly. "That's such a powerful message, especially in today's world where we often feel like people can't change or grow." The conversation flowed naturally for the first few minutes, with Alyssa Farah Griffin asking about his directing process and Ana Navarro inquiring about working with the film's young cast. Eastwood answered each question with the thoughtful precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting his craft both in front of and behind the camera. But Joy Behar had been unusually quiet, her expression growing more pointed with each passing moment. Those familiar with The View knew this was rarely a good sign. Joy had built her career on sharp political commentary and wasn't known for holding back her opinions, especially when it came to topics she felt passionate about. "Clint," Joy finally interjected, her voice cutting through the pleasant atmosphere like a blade. "Speaking of second chances, what's your take on the current political climate? Do you think certain politicians deserve second chances after, shall we say, controversial actions?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Eastwood's expression didn't change, but those who knew him well could see the subtle shift in his posture, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had spent decades avoiding overtly political discussions in interviews, preferring to let his work speak for itself. "Joy, I'm here to talk about my film," Eastwood replied evenly, his voice carrying a warning that anyone familiar with his screen persona would recognize. "I've always believed that artists should focus on their art, not on telling people how to think politically." Joy's eyes lit up with the kind of combative energy that made for compelling television but often left guests feeling ambushed. "But surely you have opinions about what's happening in our country. Your films have always had political undertones. Don't you think artists have a responsibility to speak out?" Whoopi sensed the shift in energy and attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "Maybe we should talk about the technical aspects of filmmaking. Clint, you've been directing for over 50 years now." But Joy wasn't finished. She leaned forward in her chair, her voice taking on that confrontational edge that regular viewers knew all too well. "I'm just saying, Clint, that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Surely someone with your platform and influence should be using it to address the serious issues facing our democracy." Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, the studio fell silent except for the hum of the cameras. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet intensity that had made him one of cinema's most compelling presences. "Joy, I've spent my entire career telling stories that explore the human condition. I believe in letting people think for themselves, rather than lecturing them about what they should believe. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Sarah Haynes shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Sunny Hostin glanced between Joy and Clint with growing concern. Even the usually unflappable Whoopi seemed to realize that the situation was spiraling beyond her control. Joy, however, seemed energized by the confrontation. But don't you think that's a privileged position to take? Some of us don't have the luxury of remaining silent when democracy itself is under attack. Eastwood's response was measured but firm. I think democracy is best served when people can hear different perspectives and make up their own minds, not when they're told what to think by entertainers, whether they're actors or talk show hosts. The comment hit its mark, and Joy's face flushed with indignation. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and everyone in the studio knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Joy's face flushed with indignation at Eastwood's pointed comment about entertainers telling people what to think. She straightened in her chair, her voice rising with barely contained anger. Are you seriously suggesting that I don't have the right to express my political views? That's rich, coming from someone who's made a career out of playing vigilante characters who take the law into their own hands. The studio audience stirred uncomfortably. This was clearly going in a direction nobody had anticipated. Eastwood's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the cold steel that had made him famous in westerns and crime dramas. Joy, there's a difference between expressing views and using your platform to berate guests who came here in good faith to discuss their work. I've never claimed my characters represent how people should behave in real life. They're stories, not political manifestos. Ana Navarro attempted to defuse the situation, her diplomatic instincts kicking in. Perhaps we could discuss how your films have evolved over the decades. Your more recent work has shown incredible nuance in exploring complex moral issues. But Joy wasn't backing down. If anything, Eastwood's calm responses seemed to fuel her determination to provoke a reaction. Complex moral issues, like glorifying violence and toxic masculinity? Your movies have been peddling the same outdated cowboy fantasy for decades, while real people suffer from gun violence and inequality. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alyssa Farah Griffin visibly winced, while Sarah Haynes looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Even Whoopi, who had navigated countless controversial moments on the show, seemed stunned by the directness of Joy's attack. Eastwood's voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. Joy, I think you're confusing entertainment with reality. My films explore the consequences of violence, not glorify it. And as for toxic masculinity, I've spent the last 20 years making movies about men learning to be vulnerable, to face their failures, to find redemption through compassion rather than force. Oh please, Joy shot back, her voice dripping with disdain. That's just Hollywood liberal guilt trying to rehabilitate your image. You can't spend 40 years making shoot first, ask questions later movies, and then claim you're some kind of sensitive artist. Sunny Hostin finally found her voice, attempting to bring some balance to the discussion. Joy, I think we need to acknowledge that Clint's later work, films like $1 Million Baby and Gran Torino, have shown real evolution in exploring themes of redemption and human connection. Joy turned her attention to Sunny with obvious irritation. Sunny, you're being way too generous. Gran Torino was just another white savior narrative wrapped up in pretty cinematography. And don't get me started on how his political views have influenced his storytelling. Eastwood's patience was clearly wearing thin. His hands, which had been resting calmly on the armrests of his chair, were now gripping them slightly. Joy, you seem to have already made up your mind about me and my work without any interest in an actual conversation. I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish here. What I hope to accomplish, Joy said, her voice rising to a near shout, is to get you to acknowledge that artists have a responsibility to their audiences and to society. Instead, you're sitting there acting like you're above it all, like your decades of perpetuating harmful stereotypes don't matter, because you throw in a few scenes of emotional vulnerability. The studio had gone completely silent, except for the mechanical hum of the cameras. The audience seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch this unprecedented meltdown unfold. Production assistants in the wings were frantically signaling to their supervisors, but nobody seemed to know how to stop what was happening. Whoopi made another attempt to regain control. Okay, let's take a breath here. Clint, maybe you could tell us about your upcoming projects, something lighter we can focus on. But Eastwood was no longer looking at Whoopi. His steely gaze was fixed directly on Joy, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet menace that had made him one of cinema's most intimidating presences. Joy, I've been in this business for over 60 years. I've worked with directors, actors, and producers across the entire political spectrum. I've never encountered someone so determined to turn a simple conversation into a personal attack. Joy laughed, but it was a harsh, bitter sound. Personal attack? I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the impact of your work on American culture. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be making movies anymore. The comment was a step too far, and everyone in the studio knew it. Sarah Haynes actually gasped audibly, while Anna Navarro shook her head in disbelief. Even some members of the audience began to murmur disapprovingly. Eastwood stood up slowly, his full height commanding the studio's attention. At 94, he still possessed the physical presence that had made him a star, and the deliberate way he rose from his chair sent a clear message to everyone watching. "Joy," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority and experience. "I've dealt with difficult people throughout my career. Directors who didn't know what they wanted, producers who cared more about money than storytelling, actors who thought the world revolved around them. But I've never encountered someone so fundamentally disrespectful to a guest who came here in good faith." Joy's eyes blazed with defiance. "Disrespectful? I'm holding you accountable for your choices as an artist. If you can't handle that, then maybe you're not the tough guy you pretend to be on screen." The insult was delivered with such venom that it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Alyssa Farah Griffin looked horrified, while Sunny Hostin actually put her hand over her mouth in shock. Anna Navarro was shaking her head so vigorously that her earrings swayed back and forth. For a moment, Eastwood said nothing. He simply stared at Joy with the kind of cold intensity that had made him legendary in films like Unforgiven and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute finality. "Joy, I've spent my entire career treating people with respect, regardless of their politics or personal beliefs. I came here today to talk about a film I'm proud of, about themes I believe in. Instead, you've chosen to turn this into some kind of ideological interrogation designed to embarrass me in front of your audience." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Eastwood held up a hand that somehow managed to silence her completely. The gesture was so commanding, so final, that even she seemed to recognize she had pushed too far. "I don't need to sit here and be lectured by someone who clearly has no interest in having an actual conversation." Eastwood continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've earned the right to be treated with basic human dignity, something you seem incapable of providing." The studio was now completely silent except for the sound of Eastwood's footsteps as he began to move toward the edge of the set. Joy sat frozen in her chair, seemingly stunned by the realization that she had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures past his breaking point. The studio was completely silent except for the sound of Eastwood's footsteps as he began to move toward the edge of the set. Joy sat frozen in her chair, seemingly stunned by the realization that she had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures past his breaking point. But as Eastwood reached the edge of the interview area, she seemed to recover her voice, apparently unable to let him leave without getting the last word. "That's right, just walk away," Joy called out, her voice carrying across the silent studio. "Run back to your Hollywood bubble, where nobody challenges your outdated worldview." The comment stopped Eastwood in his tracks. He turned slowly, his weathered face showing a mixture of disappointment and controlled anger that somehow managed to be more intimidating than any outburst could have been. The cameras caught every nuance of his expression as he faced the panel one final time. "Joy," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 7 decades in the entertainment industry. "I've worked with some of the most talented and difficult people in Hollywood. I've directed Academy Award winners and unknown actors with equal respect. I've collaborated with writers, cinematographers, and producers who challenged me to be better at my craft every single day." He took a step back toward the panel, not to sit down, but to ensure his words carried the full weight of his presence. "But in all my years in this business, I have never encountered someone so determined to turn a professional conversation into a personal vendetta. You invited me here under false pretenses, and then ambushed me with your political agenda." Whoopi made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Clint, please, let's just take a breath and reset. We clearly got off on the wrong foot here." But Eastwood wasn't finished. His gaze swept across the entire panel, taking in each host before returning to Joy. "Whoopi, you run a professional show, and I respect that. But you've allowed one person's personal animosity to hijack what should have been a simple interview about storytelling and filmmaking. Sarah Haynes found her voice, speaking quietly but with obvious sincerity. Clint, I want to apologize. This isn't how we normally conduct interviews, and I'm genuinely sorry you've had this experience. Eastwood nodded to Sarah with a slight smile, the first warmth he had shown since the confrontation began. Sarah, I appreciate that. You and the other ladies here have been professional and respectful. His expression hardened again as he looked directly at Joy. But you, Joy, have shown me exactly who you are. You're someone who uses your platform not to inform or entertain, but to attack and belittle anyone who doesn't conform to your narrow worldview. Joy's face was flushed with a mixture of anger and what might have been embarrassment. I was trying to hold you accountable for your influence on American culture. Artists don't get to hide behind their work when that work has real-world consequences. Accountable? Eastwood's voice rose for the first time during the entire confrontation, though it never reached a shout. Joy, you don't know the first thing about accountability. You sit behind this desk every day and tear down people who have actually built something, created something, contributed something meaningful to the world. Ana Navarro attempted to interject her diplomatic instincts, still hoping to find some middle ground. Perhaps we could all agree that art and politics intersect in complicated ways that deserve thoughtful discussion. But Eastwood shook his head, his decision clearly made. Ana, you're right that these are complicated issues that deserve thoughtful discussion. But that's not what happened here today. What happened here was an ambush designed to generate controversy at the expense of basic human decency. He turned his attention back to Joy, his voice dropping to that trademark whisper that somehow commanded more attention than any shout. I've spent my career telling stories about redemption, about people finding their way back from darkness, about the possibility of change and growth. But you, Joy, you're so consumed with your own righteousness that you can't see past your own prejudices. Joy's defiance flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. My prejudices? You're the one who's been making the same type of movie for 50 years, reinforcing the same toxic stereotypes about masculinity and violence. And you're the one who's been making the same type of judgments for your entire career? Eastwood replied, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to echo through the studio. You see what you want to see, hear what you want to hear, and attack anyone who dares to suggest that the world might be more complicated than your talking points allow. Sunny Hostin made one final attempt to bridge the gap. Clint, I think there might be some common ground here if we could just find a way to communicate more respectfully. Eastwood's expression softened slightly when he looked at Sunny. Sunny, I appreciate your professionalism and your attempt to find common ground, but some bridges can't be built when one side is determined to burn them down. He straightened to his full height, and for a moment, everyone in the studio could see the commanding presence that had made him one of cinema's most enduring icons. I came here today to talk about a film that explores themes of forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of finding meaning in the final chapters of our lives. Instead, I've been subjected to a character assassination by someone who clearly made up her mind about me long before I walked through that door. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Eastwood held up his hand with such authority that she actually fell silent. I'm done here, Joy. You can have your last word, your clever comeback, your moment of television drama, but I won't be part of it anymore. He began walking toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence of the studio. But just before he disappeared from view, he turned back one final time, his voice carrying across the set with crystal clarity. To the viewers at home, I hope you'll judge my work on its own merits, not on the opinions of someone who seems more interested in tearing down than building up. And to the professional journalists and hosts who conduct respectful interviews every day, thank you for treating your guests with the dignity that seems to be disappearing from our public discourse. With that, Clint Eastwood walked off the set of The View, leaving behind a studio full of stunned silence and a host who had finally been rendered speechless. The cameras continued to roll, capturing the unprecedented moment when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy proved that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is simply refusing to accept it. The aftermath was immediate and devastating for Joy, who sat in her chair looking like she had been hit by a truck. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly unsure how to proceed. Whoopi finally found her voice, attempting to bring some closure to the segment. Well, that was certainly unexpected, she said, her voice strained with the effort to maintain professionalism. We'll be right back after this break. But even as the cameras cut away, the damage was done. In trying to score political points against a respected guest, Joy had instead revealed the ugliness that lurked beneath her confrontational style. And Clint Eastwood, in his quiet, dignified exit, had reminded everyone watching what true strength really looks like. So what did you think about this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen a guest handle a hostile interview with such class and dignity? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the moments when Hollywood's biggest stars showed their true character under pressure.